Evan Carter had always been a curious soul, in more ways than one. He was the kind of person who couldn't resist a rabbit hole, whether it was about quantum physics, ancient civilizations, or, in this case, soul swapping. Every night, after his dull hours at a tech startup that paid him just enough to live in a shoebox apartment, Evan would find himself diving deeper into the mysteries of the human soul, spiritual practices, and the power of consciousness. He read everything from New Age philosophy to the obscure rituals buried in centuries-old books, convinced that there had to be more to life than what people saw. His friends had long given up on him. While they were out partying and chasing their own versions of fulfillment, Evan sat alone, hunched over his laptop, endlessly Googling the secrets of existence. He had even become a regular at a local occult bookstore, where the manager, an elderly man with far too many piercings for his age, had once told him, "You've got the soul of a seeker, but you've got to be careful with these things. The universe doesn't always like being messed with." Evan hadn't really taken that warning seriously. After all, what was life without a little risk? And so, when he found the ritual online, something about it felt right. The webpage, barely visible due to its outdated design, detailed an ancient ceremony for transferring souls. According to the site, it was an old Tibetan ritual that allowed one soul to leave its body and enter another's. There were risks, sure. But who cared? Evan had already convinced himself that he wasn't going to get anywhere without a little leap of faith. That night, he set up the ritual. The candles were lit, the incense was burning, and the chant was ready to go. He had read the instructions 100 times, yet still, as he muttered the incantation under his breath, there was a tickle of doubt, something he couldn't shake. But Evan was all in. He had prepared himself. He wasn't going to be one of those people who went through life too afraid to do something. The first few seconds after he spoke the final words were exhilarating. The air thickened, crackled with energy, and Evan felt a strange lightness, like he was being lifted off the ground. The room spun, and everything went white when his vision cleared. He blinked, confused. Instead of his cramped apartment, he was staring up at a sterile, white ceiling. The steady rhythm of a ventilator hummed in the background. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. Panic set in. This wasn't the warm embrace of his familiar surroundings. This wasn't even the apartment. His body felt wrong. With every ounce of strength, Evan tried to move, but his limbs were stiff. He managed to turn his head and saw his reflection in a nearby mirror, except it wasn't his reflection at all. The man looking back at him had a gaunt face, sunken cheeks, and a mess of dark hair, but it wasn't Evan's hair. The body was unfamiliar, foreign, completely alien. It was as though someone had switched him with a stranger. What the hell happened? In his panic, Evan tried to stand up, but his legs didn't respond. A wave of nausea surged through him as his body seemed to betray him at every turn. Then, he saw it, the bedside table, cluttered with family photos. The images were too familiar, too intimate, and Evan's stomach dropped as he stared at the smiling faces of a woman and a young child. He knew these people. They were Tyler Cross's family. That's when it hit him. The ritual. The soul swap. It hadn't gone as planned. He had switched souls, but instead of switching into some random person's life, he had entered a coma patient's body. Evan's heart raced. He had read the fine print on the ritual. He hadn't taken the warning seriously. If you swap into someone who is in a deep sleep or vegetative state, there was a chance that their soul would still be there, trying to claw its way back into the world. Oh no. At that moment, something inside his head clicked, like a voice that wasn't his own. It whispered, not loud enough to be audible, but clear enough to chill him to the bone. "Get out of my head." Evan froze. His blood ran cold. He tried to shake it off, but the voice came again, more distinct this time. "I'm not going anywhere, you bastard." It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't in his imagination. It was real. Tyler was still here. For a few moments, Evan couldn't process it. He sat still, staring at the walls of this unfamiliar room, as the realization settled in. Tyler, the person whose life he had just taken over, wasn't just a vegetable in the bed. His soul was still here, trapped in the confines of this unresponsive body. The voice inside his mind was sharp, like a thorn stuck under his skin. Tyler was angry, furious even, and the way he spoke only confirmed the worst. Tyler didn't want Evan here. Tyler wasn't some passive spectator. Tyler knew. Tyler was fully aware of the swap, and he was trying to wrestle back control of his own life. Evan took a deep breath, trying to focus. He couldn't just sit there and let it happen. How do I fix this? He thought. He could hear Tyler's voice again, mocking him from the back of his mind, but Evan had no idea how to proceed. You think you can just walk into my life and take it over, huh? Tyler's voice dripped with scorn. You've got another thing coming. Evan gritted his teeth. This was bad. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't considered the possibility that the other soul might fight back. But then again, how could he have? The rituals he had read about didn't mention anything about hostile co-inhabiting souls. He needed a plan. He needed answers. The longer he sat there, the more trapped he felt. But what was Tyler's real deal? Who was this guy, anyway? In the moments that followed, as the adrenaline of the switch wore off, Evan's mind began to work again. Tyler's soul wasn't just a passive observer. He was active, in the sense that he was still aware of everything happening around him. What was even worse was the slow, creeping realization that Tyler was trying to take back control of his own body, not just by force, but by wearing Evan down. Tyler was using their shared mind to make Evan's experience miserable. Every time Evan tried to make a move, try to stand, try to think, Tyler's willful presence pushed against him. It wasn't like a voice in his head, exactly. It was more like a sense of presence, an oppressive weight. It felt like Tyler was standing just behind him, whispering words of doubt, demanding he stop trying. He was a ghost. A mind in limbo. You're not going anywhere. And the thing was, Evan wasn't sure if he could. As Evan struggled to understand the limits of his new life, something else became clear. Tyler didn't just want his body back. Tyler wanted revenge. He wanted Evan to feel what it was like to be trapped. It was a psychological war, one where Evan couldn't even tell when he was losing control. Evan was stuck. There was no other way to describe it. He could feel the walls of his new reality closing in on him, thick and suffocating. His mind raced, but his body was a stranger. A foreign vessel. Tyler's body, and Tyler's mind. At least Tyler still had his mind. That fact alone should have been a relief. It meant Tyler wasn't gone. But all it did was make the situation worse. Because if Tyler was still there, in the back of his head, the body wasn't just his to command. It was a shared space. The worst part? Tyler was more than just a passive presence. He was a constant pressure, like a hand on the back of Evan's neck, pushing him down, forcing him to feel the crushing weight of the situation. At first, it was subtle. A glance from the corner of his vision, a sudden, violent jolt in his thoughts. The whispering voice that started in his head, telling him things like, "Stop trying. You don't belong here." Tyler was there, but his presence was more like a shadow, cold, quiet, and looming, always there but never fully in the light. But as Evan struggled to adjust, it became clear that Tyler wasn't going to just sit back and watch him ruin his life. No, Tyler wanted to fight. He wanted to regain control. Evan lay there in the bed, still trying to gather his bearings, when he heard Tyler's voice again. This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a full-on assault. It rang in his head like an alarm, shrill and maddening. You think you can live my life? You think you can just waltz in here and be me? The force of Tyler's anger rattled Evan's concentration. His hands twitched involuntarily. The fingers of Tyler's body stiffened as if preparing to lash out. But when Evan looked at his own reflection in the window, Tyler's reflection, that is, he saw nothing. No emotion. No response. Tyler was still locked in his own comatose body, unable to move. But his mind was wide awake, and it had no intention of letting Evan off easy. The room seemed to pulse with the silent battle between them. Evan could feel Tyler's fury, a steady, unrelenting pressure in his thoughts, pushing against his consciousness like a storm building on the horizon. Every time Evan tried to focus on something, on his breathing, on regaining control of the body, Tyler was there, interrupting, churning the waters of his mind. That it was getting harder to separate himself from Tyler's presence. Every time Evan blinked, he heard Tyler's voice louder, clearer. It wasn't just in his head anymore. It felt physical, like an actual force pressing against his brain. You can't do this. You can't win. You don't have the strength to live like I did. Shut up, Evan thought, but the thought was weak. Shut up, he muttered aloud. His voice sounded thin, unfamiliar, as though it was coming from someone else entirely. Tyler's laughter echoed in his mind. Weak. Just like the rest of you. You're nothing but a parasite, trying to hijack my life. The words burned. But Evan knew he couldn't let Tyler win. He had to figure out how to break this cycle, how to separate his soul from Tyler's without losing his mind. But with every passing minute, the idea of living in Tyler's life started to seem less like a temporary inconvenience and more like a slow, unending nightmare. The more Tyler fought back, the more Evan lost his sense of self. The door to the room opened, and a woman stepped inside. Evan blinked, confused. She looked familiar, too familiar, like someone he had known for years. He quickly pushed down his panic, doing his best to mimic the movements of Tyler's body. The woman smiled gently as she approached the bedside. Her face was full of love, but there was something else there too. Worry. Deep, consuming worry. Sophia? Evan croaked, struggling to form the words in Tyler's voice. The woman stopped. Her eyes widened in confusion, and for a moment, Evan thought maybe he had said the wrong thing. Maybe he had said the wrong name, something too familiar. But before he could clarify, her expression softened. She leaned closer, her hand gently brushing his cheek. You're awake, she whispered. You're really awake. Evan's heart skipped. He wanted to ask her 1,000 questions, to beg her to explain what was going on, but the words caught in his throat. He felt Tyler's presence surge again, a cold, suffocating weight filling his chest. She's not going to believe you, Tyler hissed. You think you can fool her? You think she'll just accept you as me? Evan flinched at the voice, feeling a cold shiver crawl down his spine. He turned his head slightly, avoiding Sophia's gaze for just a moment, trying to regain his composure. Sophia didn't seem to notice the flicker of hesitation. Her smile grew wider, and she leaned in closer, her voice a soft whisper. I'm so glad you're finally awake, Tyler. I don't know how much longer I could have, Evan began to say, but the words tangled in his throat, as though they were never meant to escape. Tyler's soul fought harder now, pulling at the edges of Evan's consciousness. The more Sophia seemed to accept him as Tyler, the more desperate Tyler became. Every part of Evan's mind screamed for release, but it was becoming clear that there was no simple way to separate himself from this body. No magic ritual, no technique, no mental trick would fix what was happening. Tyler's soul was too strong, too embedded in the fabric of this life. Sophia's voice pulled him back from the brink. Tyler, she said softly, stroking his hair. Please, don't be scared. I know it's been so long, but you're here now. You're with me. Evan's stomach churned. Her words, her touch, they were so real, so full of love, and yet they weren't meant for him. He wasn't Tyler. But the longer he remained silent, the more he realized that the line between himself and Tyler was blurring. Tyler's life wasn't just a set of memories locked in a body. Tyler's life was Sophia, was Emily, was this hospital room, and every inch of his existence that Evan had stepped into. The more Evan tried to resist, the more he felt like he was being consumed by Tyler's world. "You're not Tyler," a small voice echoed from the back of his mind. It wasn't Tyler's voice. It wasn't Evan's. It was something else entirely. Something other, something that felt like it was emerging from the depths of his subconscious. Sophia's face twisted with confusion, but there was a strange sadness in her eyes. "Tyler," she whispered, her hand trembling slightly as it hovered over his chest. "Why aren't you?" A sharp, invasive thought sliced through Evan's mind. "Get out. Leave her alone." Evan recoiled at the force of it. Tyler's anger boiled over, but it wasn't Tyler alone, it was the consciousness of two souls, struggling to coexist in the same vessel, and neither one was ready to let go. It was only when Sophia stepped back, her eyes scanning his face with growing concern, that Evan realized something had shifted. Tyler's grip on his mind was no longer subtle. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was full-on war. And for the first time, Evan could feel his own thoughts getting drowned out by Tyler's rage. The air in the room grew heavy, like a storm was about to break. His breath quickened, and then Tyler's voice cut through again, clearer than ever. "I will take this body back." There was a long, deafening silence between them. Sophia's gaze flickered from his face to the monitors, her eyes searching for something, anything that would explain what was happening to the man she loved, and that's when it happened. Evan felt his grip on his own identity slipping. His thoughts, his voice, everything felt like it was being pulled down into a void, a space between who he was, who Tyler had been, and who they were both becoming. There was no clear answer. No simple solution. Tyler had already won. Or at least, that's how it felt. But in the chaos of their mental war, something even stranger began to emerge, something neither of them had anticipated. As the room fell silent, the weight of the situation hit Evan like a freight train. It wasn't just Tyler's anger that threatened to tear him apart, it was the sense of helplessness that was closing in on him. He was losing himself. The more he tried to fight back, the less he felt like himself. Tyler's consciousness was flooding his mind like an unstoppable tide, washing away the remnants of Evan's identity. Sophia's worried gaze lingered on him. She seemed torn between hope and confusion, but the longer she stared, the more she seemed to notice the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight flinching, the way his eyes darted around the room like he was searching for something to hold on to. She had to be wondering if this was really Tyler. Was he truly awake? Or was something darker occupying his body? Evan tried to speak again, but his voice cracked, a strange rasp escaping his throat. "Sophia," it felt wrong, like the word didn't belong to him. It didn't feel like his voice. "It's me. It's Evan." But Tyler's voice surged back with a vicious force, overriding Evan's thoughts before they could fully take shape. "You don't get to speak," Tyler growled from the depths of Evan's consciousness. "You're just a passenger here. A parasite. Leave her alone. This life is mine." The conflict inside his own head was dizzying. The pressure was too much. He could feel Tyler, like a weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. Evan wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but each time he tried, Tyler's will flooded him like a tsunami. His limbs felt heavy, disconnected, as though his own body had betrayed him. Sophia's eyes narrowed. "Tyler?" She whispered softly, almost pleading. "Please. Please, come back to me." Evan's heart broke at the sight of her, at the desperation in her voice. She still believed it was him. She was still waiting for him to come back, even though he wasn't the person she thought he was. But then something else happened. A strange, quiet voice cut through the storm of thoughts inside Evan's head, so soft, so distant, that at first, he thought it was just a figment of his imagination. Don't let him win. It was a voice he didn't recognize. It wasn't Tyler's. It wasn't his own. It was something else. Who are you? Evan asked, his thoughts ragged, his mind barely hanging on. What's happening? But the voice didn't answer. Instead, it whispered again, like a soft breeze in the chaos. You can still take control. For a moment, Evan couldn't tell if he was hearing things or if there was some part of him that had been hidden away, just waiting for the right moment. But the voice felt real. It felt like a lifeline. Sophia reached out again, this time more cautiously, like she wasn't sure whether to touch him or pull away. Her hand hovered just above his. Tyler, please, she said again. It's okay. We're here. I'm here. Evan's pulse quickened, but he fought the urge to speak. The voice in his mind was louder now, almost demanding his attention. You have to fight. He's not you. He's trying to erase you. Don't let him. Tyler's rage surged again, and Evan felt the old man's bitterness claw at his skin. You don't belong here, Evan. You'll never have this life. Evan squeezed his eyes shut, struggling to hold on to his own thoughts. The battle was reaching a fever pitch, and he knew if he didn't act soon, Tyler's presence would consume him entirely. But something was shifting inside him, something he hadn't expected. The voice wasn't his, and it wasn't Tyler's, but it was speaking to him, urging him to do something. Evan inhaled sharply, his fingers twitching. He fought to remember who he was, to reconnect with the part of him that was still alive. Tyler's voice raged on. You're weak. You're nothing. You can't win. And then, something snapped. Without thinking, Evan reached out, gripping the sides of the hospital bed as though he could anchor himself to something real. The effort was primal, like the surge of adrenaline that kicks in when a person is backed into a corner. He pushed back against Tyler's will, forcing his mind to center, to clear out the noise and focus. His muscles burned with effort. His head throbbed with the effort of holding on to his identity, but he kept going. Tyler was trying to suppress him, but the more he pushed back, the clearer the voice became. You can do it. He's just a memory. A fading ghost. For a moment, there was a strange silence, a vacuum where everything stopped. The weight pressing on his mind lifted. Tyler's presence faltered, as if distracted by something, leaving a space for Evan to slip through. And then, in that brief window of freedom, Evan did something he had been too afraid to try before. He fought. He took control. His hands moved with purpose, shaking at first but gaining confidence. He sat up in Tyler's body, a surge of raw determination running through him. He forced himself to look at Sophia, who had taken a step back, her face a mix of confusion and hope. I'm here, Sophia, Evan said, the words still strange but clear. His voice still had traces of Tyler in it, but it was his, Evan's, words. He wasn't sure if Tyler could hear him, but he didn't care. The voice in his mind was still there, but it was weaker now. He had pushed through the storm. Sophia's eyes widened as she took in his expression, her hands trembling as she reached out, unsure. Tyler? Her voice cracked. I'm not him, Evan said firmly, shaking his head. I'm Evan. His chest tightened, but he didn't back down. I'm sorry. I don't know how to explain all of this, but you have to listen to me. Tyler's still here, and he's not gone. Her face fell, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she stared at him, really stared at him, as though she could see him for the first time. Evan's breath was shallow, his head spinning. The last thing he wanted was to hurt her. He didn't know how to fix this. He didn't know how to make it all go away. But for the first time, he felt like he had a chance. He could feel Tyler's presence fighting him, still lurking in the corners of his mind, but Evan had control, for now. "I can't leave you alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia's face softened. Her hands dropped to her sides, and she stepped closer, as though she didn't know whether to hug him or run away. "You're not Tyler." "No," Evan said quietly, but there was an edge to his voice. "I'm not." And then, just as the silence between them thickened, Tyler's voice cut through the stillness again, but this time, it wasn't the sharp, threatening voice from before. This time, it was softer, weaker, and almost resigned. "You think you've won?" Tyler's voice rasped. Evan's stomach turned. He felt the cold grip of Tyler's mind tightening again, but he held on to his control. He wasn't going to let this happen again. "I haven't won, Tyler," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "But I'm not giving up either." Sophia didn't say anything, but her eyes were full of something, perhaps a mix of sorrow and understanding. She reached for his hand, but then stopped herself. Her gaze flickered between him and the silent figure in the bed. For a moment it was as though time stood still, both of them stuck in this surreal limbo. Tyler's soul wasn't going to go away. He would always be there, buried in the background, whispering and clawing at the edges of Evan's mind. But Evan had learned something important in that moment. He had learned that control didn't come from force. It came from knowing when to push, and when to let go. He couldn't take Tyler's life back, but maybe, just maybe, he could share it. As the silence stretched on, Evan realized something. He wasn't trapped in Tyler's world. Not anymore. He had a life to live. And so did Tyler. Maybe, in time, they could learn to share it.